The avoidance patterns persist across relationships because most people respond to their withdrawal in ways that reinforce the cycle rather than interrupt it. They pursue when the avoidant distances, accommodate when the avoidant sets boundaries, accept breadcrumbs when the avoidant offers minimal effort, and tolerate inconsistency while hoping for change. These responses, though natural and rooted in attachment needs, give the avoidant exactly what their nervous system craves: connection without consequence, intimacy without accountability, relationship without the sustained vulnerability that genuine partnership requires. But the super empath operates differently. They possess a rare combination of deep emotional intelligence, secure self-worth, and strategic awareness that allows them to see the pattern clearly, respond to it differently, and ultimately force the avoidant into a position where they must either do genuine work to change or lose access to someone they recognize as exceptional. The super empath doesn't break the avoidant cycle through aggression or manipulation. They break it through their refusal to participate in dynamics that violate their own needs, through their ability to hold space for the avoidance wounds without accepting mistreatment, through their capacity to love someone while simultaneously refusing to abandon themselves in the process. This unique combination of empathy and boundaries, compassion and self-protection, understanding and non-negotiable standards creates the only conditions under which an avoidant might actually confront their patterns, rather than simply repeating them with someone more willing to accept dysfunction. The super empath's awareness that sees through the pattern. The super empath possesses a level of emotional intelligence and pattern recognition that allows them to identify the avoidance cycle early, often before they've become deeply enmeshed in it. While others might interpret the avoidance withdrawal as personal rejection or temporary stress, the super empath recognizes it as an attachment pattern, a nervous system response, a defensive strategy that has nothing to do with their worth or behavior. This awareness is crucial because it prevents the super empath from internalizing the avoidance distance as evidence of their own inadequacy. They don't spiral into self-doubt when the avoidant pulls away. They don't frantically review their recent behavior for mistakes. They don't desperately try to fix something they didn't break. Instead, they observe the pattern with clarity, understanding that they're witnessing the avoidance relationship with intimacy rather than receiving accurate feedback about their own lovability. This awareness comes partly from the super empath's deep understanding of attachment theory, trauma responses, and psychological defense mechanisms. They've done their own work, examined their own patterns, and developed enough insight into human behavior that they can recognize attachment wounds when they encounter them. When the avoidant begins creating distance, the super empath doesn't take it at face value. They see beneath the surface behavior to the fear driving it. They understand that the avoidance discomfort with closeness stems from early experiences where vulnerability led to pain, where dependency meant disappointment, where emotional needs were met with neglect or punishment. This understanding creates compassion without creating tolerance for mistreatment. The super empath's awareness also includes recognition of their own patterns and vulnerabilities. They know what triggers their anxiety, what activates their own attachment wounds, what makes them susceptible to accepting less than they deserve. This self-knowledge allows them to monitor their own responses to the avoidance behavior, to catch themselves before they slip into pursuit or accommodation, to maintain clear perception even when their own nervous system is being activated by the avoidance distance. They can feel the pull toward chasing the avoidant while simultaneously observing that pull with enough detachment to choose a different response. This metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe their own thinking and feeling processes, is what prevents them from becoming unconsciously trapped in the cycle. The pattern recognition that characterizes the super empath extends to seeing how the avoidance behavior fits into broader relational dynamics rather than existing in isolation. They notice not just that the avoidant withdrew after a weekend of closeness, but that this withdrawal follows the same pattern as previous instances, that it correlates with increased intimacy rather than with any specific triggering event, that it represents a consistent response to vulnerability rather than a reasonable reaction to actual problems in the relationship. This ability to see patterns across time prevents the super empath from being fooled by the avoidance explanations for their behavior. When the avoidant attributes their distance to work stress or family obligations, the super empath can acknowledge those factors while also recognizing that the deeper cause is the avoidant's discomfort with the intimacy level that preceded the withdrawal. The super empath's awareness includes understanding the difference between who the avoidant is capable of being in brief moments versus who they're capable of being consistently. They don't mistake the warm phases for the avoidant's true self that's being obscured by temporary difficulties. They recognize that both the warmth and the distance are authentic expressions of the avoidant's internal conflict about intimacy. The super empath doesn't fall into the trap of believing that if they can just be patient enough, understanding enough, accommodating enough, the avoidant will become the person they are during the warm phases permanently. They understand that sustained warmth would require the avoidant to do deep work on their attachment wounds, and they can assess whether the avoidant is actually doing that work or simply cycling through their habitual pattern. This clear-sighted awareness extends to recognizing when the avoidant is testing them, breadcrumbing them, or using them for validation without genuine intention to build sustainable partnership. The super empath can feel the difference between someone who's genuinely struggling with vulnerability and slowly building capacity for intimacy versus someone who's simply repeating comfortable patterns without real commitment to change. This discernment protects the super empath from wasting years on someone who has no intention of addressing their limitations. They give the avoidant space to grow, but they don't wait indefinitely for growth that never materializes. The super empath's awareness also includes understanding that the avoidance patterns serve a function for the avoidant, that these patterns protected them at some point, that asking someone to change these patterns is asking them to give up strategies that feel essential to their safety. This understanding creates compassion for why change is so difficult for the avoidant, but it also creates realistic expectations about the likelihood and timeline of change. The super empath knows that people change defensive patterns only when maintaining them becomes more painful than the vulnerability of releasing them, and they can assess whether the avoidant has reached that threshold or is still finding their patterns more comfortable than the alternative of genuine intimacy. The awareness that characterizes the super empath ultimately protects them from the confusion and self-doubt that keep others trapped in relationships with avoidance. They're not confused about what's happening. They're not doubting their perception when their gut tells them something is wrong. They're not gaslighting themselves into accepting explanations that don't match the pattern they're observing. This clarity allows them to make conscious choices about whether to stay or leave, whether to give the avoidant more time or cut their losses, whether the avoidant is showing genuine progress or simply cycling through familiar phases. The super empath's awareness means they're never fully blind to what's happening, never completely lost in the fog of the avoidance pattern, never so enmeshed that they can't see the relationship objectively. And this awareness is the foundation for everything else they do differently, because you can't consciously choose different responses until you first clearly see the pattern you're responding to. The emotional boundaries that protect without abandoning. The super empath's most powerful tool in breaking the avoidance cycle is their capacity to maintain firm emotional boundaries while simultaneously remaining open to connection. This is a delicate balance that most people struggle to achieve. Either they have weak boundaries and accept mistreatment in the name of love and understanding, or they have rigid boundaries that shut down connection entirely and push the avoidant away before any real relationship can develop. The super empath manages to hold both. They're emotionally available and compassionate, but they have clear limits on what they'll accept. They can empathize with the avoidance wounds without allowing those wounds to justify behavior that violates the super empath's needs. These boundaries manifest first in the super empath's refusal to participate in one-sided pursuit. When the avoidant withdraws, the super empath doesn't chase. They don't send multiple unanswered messages. They don't try to coax the avoidant back into connection through increased warmth or accommodation. They don't abandon their own life and plans, waiting for the avoidant to re-engage. Instead, they give the avoidant the space they seem to need while continuing to invest in their own well-being, relationships, interests, and goals. This refusal to pursue serves multiple functions. It protects the super empath from the emotional exhaustion of constant effort without reciprocity. It prevents them from reinforcing the avoidance pattern by rewarding withdrawal with increased attention, and it forces the avoidant to confront what it feels like when someone doesn't organize their life around the avoidance availability. The super empath's boundaries also include refusing to accept breadcrumbs as though they're substantial offerings. When the avoidant reaches out after a period of distance with minimal effort, a late night text, a vague suggestion of getting together eventually, a comment on something the super empath posted, the super empath doesn't respond with the enthusiasm and relief that breadcrumbs are designed to elicit. They might respond politely, but without investment, matching the avoidance energy rather than amplifying it. Or they might not respond at all if the breadcrumb doesn't merit response. This boundary communicates that the super empath's time and attention have value, that access to them requires genuine effort, that they're not available for the kind of low investment connection the avoidant often prefers. The emotional boundaries include the super empath's unwillingness to suppress their own needs indefinitely to accommodate the avoidant's limitations. They express their needs clearly and directly, without apology or hedging. They don't minimize what they need to make the avoidant more comfortable. They don't frame their legitimate desires for consistency, presence, and emotional availability as excessive demands. They state what they need from partnership, and they assess whether the avoidant can meet those needs. If the avoidant cannot, the super empath doesn't contort themselves trying to need less. They recognize that incompatibility isn't a moral failing on either person's part, but it is a valid reason to end a relationship. The super empath maintains boundaries around how much emotional labor they'll do in the relationship. They won't spend endless energies trying to decode the avoidance behavior, manage the avoidance emotions, or create all the intimacy and connection in the relationship. They offer care and support, but they expect reciprocity. They initiate sometimes, but they also expect to be pursued. They're vulnerable, but they expect vulnerability in return. When they notice themselves doing all the work of maintaining the relationship, they stop. This boundary forces the avoidant to either step up and participate more actively or lose the relationship to their own passivity. These boundaries protect the super empath without abandoning the avoidant because they're communicated with clarity and maintained with consistency rather than deployed as punishment or manipulation. The super empath doesn't withdraw their boundaries as soon as the avoidant shows discomfort or offers temporary improved behavior. They don't use boundaries as weapons designed to hurt the avoidant. They hold their boundaries as necessary structures that protect their own well-being and create the conditions for healthy relationship. If the avoidant can adapt to these boundaries, the relationship can continue. If they can't, the relationship ends, but not because the super empath abandoned them. It ends because the avoidant couldn't rise to meet the basic requirements of partnership. The super empath's boundaries also include protecting themselves from the emotional roller coaster that relationships with avoidance often create. They don't allow their emotional state to become entirely dependent on the avoidance availability. They maintain their own sources of joy, security, and fulfillment independent of the relationship. They don't wait in agonized suspension during the avoidance withdrawals. They continue living fully, and the avoidance distance becomes background information rather than the central fact of their emotional experience. This emotional self-sufficiency is protective, but it also models for the avoidant what healthy autonomy within relationship looks like, maintaining your own center while also being genuinely connected to another person. The boundaries the super empath maintains ultimately create the conditions under which the avoidant might actually change, rather than simply cycling through their pattern with someone new. Most avoidants never face real consequences for their withdrawal because their partners accommodate it, pursue through it, or eventually leave, but only after becoming so exhausted and damaged that the avoidant can tell themselves the partner was the problem. The super empath's boundaries create different consequences. The avoidant experiences what it's like to be with someone who won't chase them, won't accept breadcrumbs, won't suppress their needs indefinitely. This experience is uncomfortable for the avoidant, but discomfort is often the prerequisite for growth. The super empath's boundaries force the avoidant to choose. Either do the work to show up more fully in the relationship, or lose access to someone who's clearly valuable, secure, and not easily replaced. The self-worth that doesn't require external validation. The super empath possesses a level of secure self-worth that remains stable regardless of the avoidance behavior. This internal foundation is what allows them to maintain boundaries, resist pursuing, and ultimately walk away if necessary. Unlike many people who enter relationships with avoidance, the super empath doesn't need the relationship to work in order to feel valuable, lovable, or worthy. They don't interpret the avoidance withdrawal as evidence of their own inadequacy. They don't require the avoidant's consistent presence to feel secure. They don't need the avoidant to choose them in order to know their own worth. This secure sense of self is the bedrock that supports everything else they do differently in response to the avoidance patterns. This self-worth manifests first in the super empath's refusal to take the avoidance behavior personally. When the avoidant becomes distant, cold, or unavailable, the super empath understands that they are witnessing the avoidance relationship with intimacy, rather than receiving accurate feedback about their own value. They can hold simultaneously that the avoidance withdrawal feels hurtful and that the withdrawal isn't about them. This psychological separation between the avoidance behavior and their own worth protects the super empath from the spiral of self-doubt that traps others in relationships with avoidance. They don't spend hours analyzing what they did wrong, how they could be better, what they need to change to make the avoidance stay. They recognize the avoidance patterns as information about the avoidant rather than information about themselves. The super empath's self-worth also means they don't become addicted to the validation the avoidant occasionally provides. When the avoidant is warm, present, and affectionate, the super empath enjoys it but doesn't become dependent on it for their sense of okayness. They don't experience the avoidance attention as proof that they're worthy and the avoidance withdrawal as proof that they're not. Their worth is established internally, grounded in their own self-knowledge, built on their own accomplishments and character. The avoidance behavior can't add to or subtract from this foundation. This means the super empath doesn't get caught in the addictive cycle of chasing the high of the avoidance approval because they're not deriving their self-worth from external sources. This secure self-worth allows the super empath to be genuinely outcome independent in the relationship. They want the relationship to work, they're invested in it, they care about the avoidant, but they don't need the relationship to work in order to be okay. They know they'll be fine if the relationship ends. They trust their ability to heal, to find love elsewhere, to build a fulfilling life with or without this particular person. This outcome independence is paradoxically attractive to the avoidant because it removes the pressure of being responsible for the super empath's happiness. But it also creates real stakes because the super empath's willingness to walk away is genuine rather than a bluff designed to make the avoidant pursue. The self-worth that characterizes the super empath also protects them from the sunk cost fallacy that keeps many people trapped in relationships with avoidance. They don't stay in a dysfunctional relationship simply because they've already invested time, energy, and emotion into it. They don't believe that leaving would mean admitting failure or wasting the time they've spent. They assess the relationship based on its current reality and future potential, rather than on how much they've already sacrificed. This ability to cut losses when necessary, to walk away from what isn't working without seeing it as a reflection of their own inadequacy, is rooted in their secure sense of self-worth. They know that choosing to leave a relationship that doesn't meet their needs is an act of self-respect rather than failure. The super empath's self-worth manifests in their comfort with being alone. They don't stay in relationships out of fear of solitude. They've cultivated a life they genuinely enjoy, friendships that nourish them, interests that engage them, a relationship with themselves that feels satisfying. Being single isn't a crisis to be avoided at all costs. It's a valid and often preferable state to being in a relationship that requires constant accommodation of someone else's inability to show up consistently. This comfort with solitude means the super empath is never trapped by desperation. They're choosing the relationship actively, rather than clinging to it out of fear of the alternative. The self-worth of the super empath also includes a realistic and compassionate assessment of their own strengths and limitations. They don't need to be perfect. They don't require the relationship to go smoothly, without conflict or difficulty. They can acknowledge when they've made mistakes, when they've contributed to problems, when they need to adjust their own behavior. But they distinguish between reasonable self-examination and the kind of excessive self-blame that accepts responsibility for problems they didn't create. When the avoidant suggests that the super empath's needs are too much, that their expectations are unreasonable, that they're the source of the relationship's difficulties, the super empath can consider whether there's truth in these claims without automatically accepting them as gospel. Their self-worth includes enough self-knowledge to distinguish between valid criticism and deflection. This secure self-worth creates a dynamic where the super empath becomes more attractive to the avoidant precisely because they don't need the avoidant. The avoidant has spent their life encountering people whose worth seemed to depend on the avoidant's approval, whose happiness required the avoidant's presence, whose stability demanded the avoidant's consistency. The super empath is different. They're self-possessed, internally grounded, complete without the avoidant. This independence triggers something in the avoidant because it represents what they've been seeking. Someone who won't become dependent, won't need too much, won't make the avoidant responsible for their emotional state. But paradoxically, the super empath's self-worth also activates the avoidant's own attachment anxiety because someone this secure might actually leave, might actually mean it when they say they won't accept breadcrumbs, might actually value themselves enough to walk away from what doesn't serve them. The self-worth of the super empath is ultimately what allows them to be the one who breaks the avoidance cycle because it means they're not emotionally desperate for the relationship to work. They can give the avoidant space to grow without anxiously hovering over that growth process. They can walk away if growth doesn't materialize without feeling that they're losing their only chance at love. They can maintain boundaries without collapsing when the avoidant tests those boundaries. They can love someone fully while simultaneously knowing they'll be okay if that love isn't reciprocated or sustained. This combination of genuine care and secure independence creates the only environment in which an avoidant might feel safe enough to risk vulnerability while also feeling threatened enough by the possibility of loss that they're motivated to actually change rather than simply cycling through their comfortable patterns with someone new who'll accept what the super empath will not. The strategic detachment that forces the avoidance reckoning. The super empath's most powerful intervention in breaking the avoidance cycle is their capacity for strategic detachment, the ability to love someone while simultaneously releasing attachment to outcomes, the skill of remaining emotionally available while withdrawing investment in one-sided pursuit, the strength to step back and allow the avoidant to experience the natural consequences of their patterns. This detachment isn't coldness or punishment. It's a conscious choice to stop participating in dynamics that enable the avoidant to avoid confronting their own limitations. The super empath understands that as long as they're willing to accommodate, pursue, and accept minimal effort, the avoidant has no motivation to change. The discomfort that might motivate growth is cushioned by the super empath's continued availability, despite the avoidant's inconsistency. Strategic detachment begins with the super empath consciously withdrawing the emotional labor that has been maintaining the relationship. They stop initiating contact to check in on the avoidant. They stop making plans and managing the logistics of time together. They stop sending thoughtful messages designed to make the avoidant feel cared for. They stop being the one who brings up important conversations or addresses issues in the relationship. This withdrawal isn't about punishing the avoidant, it's about creating space for the avoidant to either step forward and take responsibility for their own participation in the relationship or demonstrate through their continued passivity that they're not capable of partnership. The strategic detachment includes the super empath redirecting their energy and attention toward their own life rather than the relationship. They reinvest in friendships that have been neglected while they focused on the avoidant. They pursue goals and interests that took a backseat to relationship management. They fill their time with activities that genuinely fulfill them, rather than leaving space in their schedule, waiting for the avoidant to be available. This redirection serves multiple purposes. It protects the super empath's well-being by ensuring their life isn't organized around someone else's inconsistent presence. It demonstrates to the avoidant what they're losing as the super empath becomes increasingly independent and fulfilled. And it creates genuine distance that forces the avoidant to experience what the relationship feels like when someone isn't pursuing them. The super empath's strategic detachment also involves emotional withdrawal in ways the avoidant will notice. The warmth remains, but the intensity decreases. The care continues, but the investment diminishes. The super empath stops being emotionally affected by the avoidant's withdrawal. When the avoidant distances, the super empath no longer experiences anxiety or hurt. They experience neutrality. When the avoidant returns with warmth, the super empath no longer floods with relief and renewed hope. They experience mild appreciation without the previous desperation. This emotional leveling is powerful because it removes the emotional feedback the avoidant has become accustomed to receiving. The avoidance behavior no longer creates the reaction patterns they're used to, which forces them to recognize that something fundamental has shifted. Strategic detachment includes the super empath becoming genuinely outcome independent about the relationship's future. They stop hoping the avoidant will change. They stop waiting for the avoidant to be ready. They stop believing that patience will eventually be rewarded. Instead, They accept the avoidant exactly as they are in the present moment and make decisions based on that reality rather than potential. This acceptance doesn't mean approving of the avoidant's limitations. It means releasing the attachment to the avoidant, becoming someone different. If the avoidant can only offer inconsistent connection, the super empath accepts that this is what the avoidant offers and decides whether it's enough. Usually, once the super empath reaches genuine acceptance of the avoidant's limitations, the answer is that it's not enough, and the super empath begins the process of ending the relationship. The strategic detachment forces the avoidance reckoning because it removes the safety net the avoidant has relied on. The avoidant has operated with the unconscious assumption that no matter how they behave, no matter how often they withdraw, no matter how inconsistent they are, the super empath will remain available, will continue pursuing, will accept whatever minimal effort the avoidant provides. The super empath's detachment destroys this assumption. Suddenly, the avoidant faces the possibility of real loss. The person who has been accommodating their patterns is no longer doing so. The relationship that felt secure, despite the avoidant's limited investment, is becoming unstable. The super empath who was always there is becoming increasingly unavailable, increasingly independent, increasingly indifferent to whether the avoidant stays or goes. This reckoning activates the avoidant's own attachment system in ways that their comfortable distance during the relationship never did. Many avoidants discover that they have more capacity for pursuit, for consistency, for vulnerability than they believed when they're faced with the genuine prospect of losing someone they recognize as valuable. The super empath's detachment creates urgency that the avoidant hasn't felt before. Suddenly, they're the one wondering where the super empath is, what they're doing, whether they're moving on. They're the one feeling anxious about the relationship's stability. They're the one who needs to step forward with effort and consistency if they want to maintain the connection. This role reversal is often the only thing powerful enough to break through the avoidance defenses because it triggers their own fear of abandonment that their distancing strategies have been designed to avoid. The strategic detachment also forces the avoidant to confront what they're actually losing. When the super empath was pursuing, accommodating, and accepting breadcrumbs, the avoidant could take their presence for granted. But when the super empath withdraws, when they become genuinely busy and fulfilled with their own life, when they stop organizing their existence around the avoidant's availability, the avoidant sees clearly what they had. They recognize the super empath's exceptional qualities, the emotional intelligence, the secure self-worth, the capacity for both empathy and boundaries, the refusal to play games or engage in manipulation. They realize that the super empath is exactly the kind of partner most people spend their entire life hoping to find, and the avoidant is about to lose them, not through any external circumstance, but through their own inability to show up consistently. The reckoning that the super empath's strategic detachment forces includes the avoidant having to make a conscious choice rather than defaulting to their habitual patterns. With most partners, the avoidant can continue their cycle of approach and withdrawal indefinitely because those partners adapt to it, accept it, organize their lives around it. The super empath's detachment makes this impossible. The avoidant must choose. Either do the deep internal work necessary to show up differently in the relationship or lose the super empath entirely. There's no middle ground where they can maintain access to the super empath while continuing their patterns. The super empath has removed that option through their detachment. And this binary choice, change or lose the relationship, is often the only catalyst powerful enough to motivate an avoidant toward genuine transformation. The strategic detachment isn't a guarantee that the avoidant will change. Many avoidants, when faced with this reckoning, choose their familiar patterns over the vulnerability that genuine intimacy requires. They let the super empath go rather than do the work necessary to maintain the relationship. This outcome is painful for the super empath who genuinely cared about the avoidant and hoped for different results. But it's also clarifying because it reveals that the avoidant isn't ready or willing to change, that the relationship would never have worked regardless of how much the super empath accommodated. That ending, it is the right choice despite the sadness it brings. For the avoidants who do respond to the reckoning by beginning genuine work on their attachment patterns, the super empath's strategic detachment becomes the turning point in their healing journey. They recognize that they nearly lost something irreplaceable due to their own limitations. They understand that their patterns, which they've rationalized as necessary self-protection, actually cost them the very connection they crave. They see that the super empath's withdrawal wasn't cruelty, but rather a natural consequence of the avoidant's consistent unavailability. And this recognition, painful as it is, creates the motivation necessary for them to enter therapy, to examine their attachment wounds, to develop new strategies for staying present when intimacy feels threatening. The super empath's strategic detachment doesn't fix the avoidant, but it creates the conditions under which the avoidant might finally be motivated to fix themselves. The super empath's strategic detachment ultimately breaks the avoidant cycle because it refuses to participate in the dynamics that have maintained the cycle across the avoidant's previous relationships. It removes the enabling that has allowed the avoidant to continue their patterns without consequence. It creates real stakes where previously there were none. It forces consciousness where previously there was unconscious repetition. It demands choice where previously there was comfortable default. And most importantly, it ensures that the super empath doesn't sacrifice themselves, doesn't abandon their own needs, doesn't lose years to someone who may never be capable of genuine partnership. The strategic detachment protects the super empath while simultaneously creating the only conditions under which the avoidant might actually transform, rather than simply moving on to repeat the same cycle with someone new who hasn't yet learned that accepting an avoidance patterns only ensures those patterns will continue indefinitely. That real love requires both people to show up consistently. That empathy without boundaries is self-abandonment rather than compassion. And that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone trapped in destructive patterns is to step back and allow them to experience the full weight of the consequences their behavior creates.